Hello, alumni and friends. Welcome to Titian and Cambridge, Three Masterpieces Reinterpreted with Luke Syson, Director and Marley Curator of the Fitzwilliam Museum, presented by Cambridge in America. On behalf of Cambridge in America, I hope you are all safe and well in these unusual times. We are glad you are joining us today for our first event of the new year. As you may know, Cambridge in America is the outpost in North America for the colleges and the university, handling alumni engagement, events, and fundraising. Part of our role is to help you connect with the university and your colleges, as well as with each other. Today, we have 500 alumni and friends registered for this event, tuning in from around the world. Welcome again to those just joining us. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Your camera and microphone will be turned off throughout. This session will have a Q&A following the presentation, moderated by Patty Danver, Senior Director, Strategic Engagement from Cambridge in America. You are welcome to submit Q&A questions throughout the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Our speaker will attempt to address as many questions as possible, but time is limited. We thank you in advance for your understanding if your question is not answered. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Cambridge in America website. We are in for a feast of the senses today with Luke Syson, the 14th director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, as we view three extraordinary Titians in the Fitzwilliams collection. A few words about Luke before we begin. From 2012 to 2019, he was the chairman of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he led the complete refurbishment of the British Galleries, a $22 million project, which opened in March of 2020. Luke has held curatorial positions at the British Museum, the V&A, and the National Gallery, where he led the successful campaign to acquire Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks, and curated the highly acclaimed exhibition, Leonardo da Vinci, Painter at the Court of Milan in 2011. We are thrilled to have him here with us today. Please welcome Luke Syson.
It's very good to see everybody, or not quite to be able to see everybody. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to be both in Cambridge and in a way back in America, where, as you've just heard, I spent 7 very happy years at the Met. I'm going to share my screen now. So what I'm showing you now is the Fitzwilliam Museum itself. Now, many of you, of course, will have spent time in the museum during your period in Cambridge. A monumental, very grand, and for some, somewhat forbidding building on Trumpington Street. And there it is on a sunny day. So as you come into the museum, you enter this extraordinary entrance hall, one of the great masterpieces of museum architecture from the 19th century. And here's another view of that space. And a gallery that opens out from there that houses our early Italian pictures, and that still has the gold-painted Hessian that was put on the walls by our greatest ever director, Sir Sidney Cockerell, back in the 1920s. It's a repository of amazing objects, over 500,000 altogether, and I'm just going to give you a tiny glimpse of some of them as we move forward. So here, for example, is the earliest work, a Paleolithic sculpture of a reindeer carved into a stone. Here are one of an enormous number of very beautiful Greek coins. Here, the magnificent Peterborough Psalter. And I'm just really trying to give you an idea of the range of the collections that move from antiquities to paintings to manuscripts to prints and drawings. So works like this very beautiful Rembrandt, and then also rather unexpected items like the work by Handel that you see here. There's also what one might describe as a certain amount of low art, one of the most extraordinary collections of English pottery in the country, including this rather henpecked Adam, who seems to be under the thrall of a gigantic Eve, as conceived in Staffordshire in the mid-18th century. And then absolute masterpieces like Millet's Bridesmaid, and some of the very few wax models by Degas that are outside North America. And finally, literary manuscripts of the importance of Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own. And perhaps it's an appropriate place to finish this little roundup of what Fitzwilliam contains with one of the great feminist texts, as I seek to tackle a problem in art history that these three paintings that I'm about to show you now throw up. So, as the title of this lecture suggests, we have three very great Titians at the Fitzwilliam, one of which was given to us, this one, by Viscount Fitzwilliam himself, and another, this, which was donated 100 years later. What we are beginning to realize, I think, at the Fitzwilliam is that the combination of a magnificent Victorian building and of rich historic collections are not automatically compelling for everybody today. And that finding the right narratives, the right stories that truly respect the essence and integrity of the objects themselves is very important as we reimagine our collections and the stories, as I say, that they can tell. So what I want to do this evening is to talk a little bit about just one case study, one example of how one might reinterpret three paintings with that particular question in mind. So to take you on a journey of how Titian got from a world of sonnets and madrigals, of the reverent worship of the goddess of love. And this is a picture about all sorts of competing pleasures, sensual and other, and more intellectual, to here, to the Rape of Lucretia. Still two figures, the man still clothed, the woman again near naked, but now addressing sexual violence against women, political and personal tyranny by men, and subsequent suicide. And how might this, our third work, a very great drawing, help us understand the other two? Is it a drawing of lovemaking or an assault? And the fact that we can't tell is revealing of itself. And how might all of these works help us understand the world that we live in today? I don't think you need me to tell you that 2020 was one of the most extraordinary years we've all lived through, and that the first few days of 2021 seem no easier. 2020 was a year that reminded us that despite our best efforts, humans are not in control of their fates, or of our rulers, or sometimes indeed of ourselves. And there are various ways, I think, that we could respond to that situation. We can try to make sense of it through science, through theology, or in an artist's case, through analytical viewing. But that wasn't Titian's way. Instead, he first favored an elegant escapism, a territory that he turned into a mainstay of his business. And then something extraordinary happened. Right at the end of his life, Titian sought ways of representing those ungovernable forces, those perils of being vulnerably human. If 2020 was a difficult year, 1570, when Titian painted his Lucretia, was not much better. January saw Ivan the Terrible ordering the massacre of Novgorod and the shooting of Scottish Regent James Stuart, which was actually the first assassination using a firearm, which threw Scotland into a civil war. In July, the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus began, and that was bloody at a level that it's almost incomprehensible to think about today. In August, at the end of the Third World War of Religion ended in France, bringing years of, again, appalling violence between Protestants and Catholics to an end. And what of nature herself? There was a huge volcanic eruption at Santorini, and nearer to Titian's adopted city of Venice, in Ferrara, there was an earthquake that began on November 16th, with over 2,000 aftershocks continuing for 4 years. So, a difficult time to be living through, just like ours. And how did Titian respond? Well, to begin with, as I say, a form of escapism, I think. Titian painted the Venus and Cupid with a lute player when he was already in his 1960s. It was probably a commission from the Habsburg family, the imperial family, and was certainly in Prague by 1621, so likely owned by Rudolf II. The picture has its origins in earlier masterpieces by Giorgione, for example, and by Titian. They describe a world of lovemaking and music making, of the gently erotic, of men's admiration for the naked female form. And they became, to some extent, for Titian, pictures that could be produced by rote, with a kind of cut and paste of cartoons and templates, which he could use to make new works. A whole series of works seems to have begun when he gave in 1548 a Titian to his greatest of all patrons in that early period, Charles V. It was described as his finest work, but then it seems to be lost. And the best surviving version is this one in the Uffizi. But he also used it to trace and reproduce the figure of Venus and Cupid for a number of other works. A series of 3 paintings of Venus and the organist, and then 2 pictures, including ours, of Venus and a lute player. Now, what's very nice for me is that now being responsible for this work is a continuation of a journey that I began in New York, not as its curator, but as its admirer, for its twin or near twin at the Met. And much discussion has happened over the years as to what the relationship between these 2 pictures actually is. Nowadays, I think what we're beginning to understand, as a result not least of scientific examination of both, is that the Met picture is almost entirely painted by Titian's workshop, based on a picture based on the work that he created for this unknown Habsburg patron that's now in Cambridge. And we know that because under the surface of our picture in Cambridge are lots of changes of mind. So Venus's head, for example, looked in the other direction towards the lutenist, and he changed it back to look away with this rather kind of poetic and abstract expression that the young woman has now. And I think you can see just in making the comparison how that process of copying worked. So, for example, if you look at the head of the woman, of Venus, you can see that that there's a sort of looser brushstroke in the image on the left than the image on the right, which is tightened up a bit. So if you look, for example, at the painting around her eyes, that has that slightly mechanical sense of a copy. And in fact, there's a slight sort of Disney effect that's come in. I think you can see it most clearly in the way in which the pearls are painted around her neck, or their different necks. You can see how in the Fitzwilliam picture on the left, the pearls sit within her clavicle, across the bones of her upper chest, whereas somehow they've become a kind of a little string of popcorn that sort of sits on top rather than properly integrated within the body here. And you can see this in the rather beautifully regimented landscape of the Fitzwilliam picture, as opposed to the frankly rather messy attempt to emulate Titian's style in the Met picture. Above all, and I think this is the crucial thing, you can see that in the Fitzwilliam painting, Titian has taken the trouble to transpose a whole part of what we now understand to be one part of the performance of a madrigal. These pictures have been considered to be the sort of bread and butter erotic works that Titian painted without any profound meaning. And perhaps, as we can see, once details are eliminated, that's what they become. But they've also been considered Neoplatonic allegories of the senses, with sight and hearing as instruments to gain knowledge of beauty and harmony. This is a painting about the arts, about artifice, about words and music, madrigals and sonnets, the pastoral. And it's a way of giving a kind of order to our own sensual and sensory responses, categorizing music and words, painting and sculpture were all part of the dialogue on the arts that was very current in the 16th century. And it's almost diagrammatic, the way it's laid out. So if you look, for example, at the way Venus, let's call her Venus, is painted, she somehow seems to float in front of the lutenist, with her legs her feet resting, well, where are they exactly? So there's a kind of sense in which this, both the method of composition and the way in which it's broken up, this scene into its component parts, helps us understand what we're seeing. And of course, we're very much implicated as the third major, or fourth if you count Cupid, protagonist, as I'll show you in a second. Our own capacity to listen, to look, to feel love, to bring harmony is very key. So I think this picture would have been completely comprehensible to anyone who knew anything about the madrigal, and the whole of the range of music is represented from the highest to the lowest parts of that performance. So there's a lutenist, as you can see, and a recorder player with a bass file turned to the right. So there's the recorder, and there is the lutenist. So these are the highest and the middle range. The lute fills in the middle voice range, and we're shown the part, and then we're shown the part books in some detail. So here is that one inscribed tenor, and it's odd, really, that it's so far from the lutenist. So are we in fact the singers here, even though the music is turned away from us? So some quite complicated things going on here. And then the presence of the abandoned viol that you've seen earlier on as the edge of it suggests the third bass performer. Perhaps again, that could be us. So the music is only a series of generalized note forms and not absolutely clearly described a particular one, but it's been described as an excellent impression of a madrigal, only lacking the time signature where it should be in the first line. So Titian is telling us that this is not a real piece of music, but an idealized one. And this is really all about, I think, the way in which theorists of the time saw music as being about harmony. So what we're talking about here is a whole impression that every ingredient of the world can exist in harmonious companionship, and that we're part of that joined up world of beauty and pleasure. There's something slightly distancing, perhaps, in the way in which this is painted, but at the same time, it invites us to think about that whole question of how love, how harmony, how calm are presented. I just want to show you a couple of telling details, as we'll come back to them. They're important for what Titian does later. This little wispy veil that in a sense draws attention as much as it conceals. The beautiful detail of her jewelry, very much present day of the 16th century. And then the lutenist's dagger that he has tucked away by his side, just to remind you of his capacity for violence put away at the moment, and perhaps his masculine presence. So if this picture is about love and harmony, does it have a more precise meaning? Well, in the 18th century, they certainly thought so. People thought that it was a picture of, as you can see, Philip II, Charles V's successor, and his mistress. So that's almost certainly not the case, but does it help us at all to understand how, in this journey, to understand how Philip II interacted with Titian? And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about Philip II as a lover and as a husband, and to show you 3 images of him that are in the Fitzwilliam's collection. He had 4 queens, but also seemingly countless love affairs. His public persona was characterized by a rhetoric of abstinence, and in private he indulged in the pleasures of the flesh. How this was viewed is very important for what's going to come next. So when Philip II was still a teenager, the emperor left 2 handwritten letters of instruction for his son. The first, headed confidential, was full of advice on his personal and public behavior. Philip was adjured to stick to 2 principles, and one of those was to accept good advice at all times, avoiding flatterers, but accepting the good advice given to him by his counselors and making sure to preserve their freedom so that their opinions are given freely. Now, this is very much the kind of in line with all the instruction that the education that was absolutely fundamental to the education of a prince in the Renaissance. Charles V went on, because these were letters that he'd sent to Philip when Philip was still young. And he said, "You'll soon marry, but once he's married, you should be moderate in your pleasure, because besides being harmful both to bodily growth and strength, often it," and I suppose what he means is intemperate lovemaking, "impairs the capacity to have children and can kill." Philip was therefore to limit his access to his wife and to keep away from her as much as possible. And when with her, let it be briefly. However, he must be faithful to her and not dally with other women. So Philip was married, as I say, 4 times, and each of these marriages brought him into a deeply complicated relationship with other parts of his family. So his first wife, Maria Manuela, to whom he was married from just 1543 to 45, was his double first cousin, and they shared all 4 grandparents. The first marriage took place in Salamanca, and a few days later, the royal couple stopped to visit Philip's grandmother, they're both their grandmothers, the Mad Queen Juana, who'd gone out of her mind when her husband, the Flemish Philip the Fair, died unexpectedly. And I think what we're beginning to see is the stories that have a potency and power that are really only rivaled in a way by Greek myth and legend. Consanguinity continued with wife number 2, England's own, I should say, Mary Tudor, and reached a peak with his 4th marriage to Anne of Austria, to whom he was married from 1570 to 1580. She was actually his sister's daughter, so as well as his wife, she was also his niece. And Philip's family tree, therefore, was of enormous complexity. I would say only rivaled by that of Jupiter and the gods. This is a letter written by one of his mistresses, to one of his mistresses by Saint Teresa of Avila. We don't have an image of her or any of the others. And despite his exhortations to virtue, Charles's exhortations to virtue, I should say, the Venetian ambassador reviewing Philip's love affairs reviewed that he declared that he is addicted to women. So quite the opposite of his severe public persona. I just want to give you a snapshot, for example, of what Philip was up to in 1555, when his marriage to Mary Tudor was being negotiated. Immediately after the wedding in England, Philip traveled to the Netherlands, where he had affairs with at least 2 women, one of whom bore him a child. It's hard to imagine that those women had much choice in the matter, and that was also true for his wives. When he married his 3rd wife in 1559, his mistress was one of the ladies in waiting to his sister Juana. Again, a position of dependency. She too got pregnant in 1564 and was married off. This whole history of marrying cousins, of nieces, of love affairs and illegitimate children, of dynastic planning and illicit liaisons has, as I say, something of the incestuous character and the unruly love lives of the gods of ancient Greece and Rome. And I think it's important to recognize that the sense of immediacy of those myths was much greater than it is now. They'd not yet, the characters in them had not yet become sort of tamed into fairy tales, and were still enormously, hugely vengeful in the way that they were perceived, or considered loving forces that held human beings in thrall, that could determine destinies. And in this context, we might ponder the notion of the divine right of kings that made monarchs the closest thing there was to gods on earth. It puts a particular complexion on the relationship between Philip and his lovers. And again, I think we could argue has resonances today in the power play between some men and some women, and the way in which sexual potency is regarded as being metaphorical for political power in certain quarters. A picture like the Fitz, Venus and the Lute player presents a blurring between these worlds of the human and the contemporary, combined with the timeless and the immortal. And that's important for what will come next, for how Habsburg identity could meld with Greek mythology. Because I think the road between the 2 Fitzwilliam pictures is occupied by a famous sequence of paintings that were begun before Philip became King of Spain and continued afterwards. So they were begun with 2 paintings, one in England in the collection of the Duke of Wellington, and another in Spain, which were all reproductions, versions of pictures that Titian had painted before, and which show rather conventional images of the nude. And looking at the female nude from different angles was described as very much the point. So Danae passively receiving the shower of gold that disguises Jupiter, and Venus attempting rather ineffectually to prevent Adonis going to the hunt. Now, we already know that that story has a nasty end. And perhaps it was when it was that prompted Titian, when Philip II became top dog, number 1 Habsburg, after the abdication of his father, that caused him to create a really extraordinary sequence of works that takes us into a very different realm indeed. And those started with the image of Andromeda, tied as a sacrifice to placate the wrath of Neptune, and saved thanks to the human intervention, again, powered by the help of the gods, by Perseus, this painting in the Wallace collection. So a human being helpless, helplessly enthralled to the forces of nature, or divine forces, however one might want to see it. Even more appalling in a way is the story of Diana and Actaeon. You'll remember that the sequel to this is that poor Actaeon, who stumbled across Diana during the course of the hunt, was turned into a stag and ripped to pieces by the goddess's hounds, simply for the accident of having come across her bathing, a terrible punishment of a young human being. Just as brutal was Diana's punishment of the nymph Callisto, who had been made pregnant thanks to another of the amorous adventures of Jupiter, who had taken her against her will. Her pregnancy is being here revealed to Diana's entourage, and she herself is being cast out to face another hideous fate. And I think the tremendous pathos of her face in shadow is absolutely extraordinary. So if we're looking at pictures of beautiful women with their clothes off for the delectation of the Spanish king, Titian is incorporating the ingredient now that is vast and tragic. You simply can't look at these pictures without feeling a sense of the danger and pity that they contain. And you can see too that their mode of painting is changing, even on a small screen like the ones I'm sure many of you are looking at. The painting is looser, and in some ways that sense of the wildness, the irrationality of the gods is beginning to be conveyed in a looseness of brushstrokes, a sense of something that's in a sort of constant, a painting that's almost in constant flux. The painting, this sequence climaxed with a picture which has been regularly analysed as purely erotic, and where I think you can see an enormous jump has been made between the smoothed out body of Danae and this rather wonderfully dimply cellulite Europa, the great treasure, of course, of the Gardner collection in Boston. Her vulnerability, her indignity, her clutching on for dear life, the randomness, again, with which she's been plucked from her companions by Jupiter disguised as a bull, are all features of this work. That sense that suddenly something can happen to you that is completely beyond your control. It's a theme, this double theme of erotic encounter and violence that seems to sit within the Fitzwilliam's drawing. I'm just going to take you through a few slides of this, but I think you can see now how his technique at the beginning of the 1560s, which is when this drawing was probably executed. So about 5 or 6, maybe as many as 10 years after the Lute, the Venus and the Lute player, how that violence of composition and that sense of almost a kind of the movement of their own encounter is encapsulated in the extraordinary black chalk of this work. But what actually is happening here? Well, I'll just sort of show you some of these amazing details. They're irresistible. And Titian must have not exactly dashed this off, but he must have worked fast. And you can see that there are many, many changes of mind as he's moved, for example, the position of the arms and thought about positioning of the shoulders. I show you here an even more extraordinary detail with some areas that are simply not decipherable. So what, for example, is this shape that's emerging between this woman's legs? So it's the work has been associated with a rather benign one, probably belonging to roughly the same moment as the Venus and the Lute player, which was recorded by Van Dyck in Genoa when he visited there in the early 17th century in this amazing sheet in the BM. And it's quite likely to be this work at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which seems to pretty much reflect Van Dyck's copy, although things have moved around. So some arguments have been made that this may be a second version of, again, an encounter between this time a warrior and a naked woman, probably Venus and Mars. But is something less benign happening? Certainly, the Christoph Schwarz, when he painted his Rape of Lucretia, Rape of Proserpina, also at the Fitzwilliam, thought so. And Titian had painted pictures for Schwarz's patrons in Munich, and so there was quite a likely a route through for that. So there you can see that arm coming across the body, the raised leg, and so on. It's not absolutely exact, but I think it's hard to imagine this couple without Titian's drawing. And similarly, although again, not an exact quotation, if you look at particularly the body of Proserpine in this early 17th century work executed in Venice by Padovanino, then you can see that the potential for violence in this work is very great. Rubens certainly thought so and based his Rape of the Daughters of Leucippus, now in Munich, on our drawing, which seems perhaps to have travelled north by then, since it was also copied by another Flemish painter. And importantly too, and I don't think this has been noticed until I started putting this lecture together, Tintoretto, in painting the Rape of Lucretia, seems to have based his figure of Tarquin on the man in Titian's drawing. So in other words, a drawing that bridges the world of the amorous and consensual with that of sexual violence. And it's an ambiguity that informs, but I think does not completely explain, this, one of Titian's very greatest late works, probably the last of pictures of this scale and ambition to leave his studio. Titian, by then, is already in his 80s. And this shows a painting which is at an extraordinary level. No longer as is the contemporary work of the Flaying of Marsyas, the forces of the gods exerted on the immortals, but now an entirely human history about the abuse of power and the appalling treatment of women. Still about ungovernable forces and their dire consequences. And it's worth mentioning, since the subject was to become so familiar, that this appears to be the first full-scale picture of the Rape of Lucretia. Okay, I'm just going to quickly finish, because I'm already running over time a little, just by reminding you of this story. Lucretia was a noble woman in ancient Rome. This was a very well-known story in around 500 BC. She was a wife of Collatinus, and her rape by Tarquin, the son of the last king of Rome, was the cause of the rebellion that overthrew the Roman monarchy and led to the Republic. Lucretia was described as beautiful and virtuous, a model wife. And when the king of Rome sent his son Tarquin to her home while Collatinus was away fighting, she welcomed him with the hospitality that his position merited. At night, however, Tarquin entered her bedroom by stealth, quietly going around the slaves who were sleeping at her door. And when she awakened, he offered her two choices. She could submit to his sexual advances and become his wife and future queen, or he would kill her and one of her slaves, and placing their bodies together, claim that he had caught her in adultery. Lucretia submitted, but when she, the next day, she sent for her father and her husband, she extracted from them an oath of vengeance and then drew a dagger and stabbed herself in the heart. After her death, the revolutionaries took the bloody corpse of Lucretia to the Roman Forum, where it was displayed as a reminder of the dishonor committed. So up till that moment, people had seen, for example, in this Botticelli, images of Lucretia displayed in the Forum, or of her suicide, this earlier work by Titian, and it had often been used as an excuse to show a woman either completely undressed or undressed from the waist up. So there is no question that despite her moral exemplarity, there was an ambiguity in the way in which Lucretia was depicted for the male gaze. Titian, in making this work, hoped that he had pleased Philip, and he called it the Roman Lucretia violated by Tarquin. Before being sent to Spain, he claimed it was an invention involving greater labor and artifice than anything perhaps that I had produced for many years. The interesting thing was that what he did was to take prints, some of them very explicitly erotic, showing, for example, Tarquin as naked as Lucretia herself, for private and almost semi-pornographic delectation by patrons, such as these two German works by Heinrich Aldegraver. Some of the violence that he found also appears in works like this, after a composition by Giulio Romano, where the interpolation of a witness and the clothing of Tarquin is obviously very close. And Titian's creative reuse of these images is very interesting. Finally, he seems to have looked again to the north and this Fontainebleau work by the master LD, probably Léon Davant, where the raised blade and particularly this awful image of Tarquin's knee thrust between Lucretia's awkwardly twisted legs is very, very startling. So I want to show you some details of this terrible and remarkable painting to show you, I think, that what we're talking about here is not a painting that was designed to titillate, as so many commentators in the last century claimed, but one which is about catharsis and tragedy, with no doubt of Tarquin's total guilt and Lucretia's total innocence. One simply can't ignore, for example, the violence of Tarquin's expression. Look at that highlight in the white of his eyes and the gleam of white paint on his dagger. Absolutely extraordinary mode of painting. Or the tremendous pathos of Lucretia's attempts to restrain him, that hand against that incredible mess of gold and black that is Tarquin's doublet. Above all, look at how much attention Titian has given to the painting of Lucretia's head, those tears that spill down her cheeks, and the contrast to the very soft and giving painting of her body. Something again that has misled commentators into thinking that this is about erotic pleasure. I do think it's fascinating that Titian has taken some of the ingredients, the string of pearls, the jewelry, the dagger, from his earlier work and completely repurposed them for this one. And you see that here with Lucretia's raised arm. So too, he has taken the that little float of drapery that across Lucretia's groin from Venus's groin from the earlier picture and turned it into something else. And by making Tarquin's thigh and knee bare, a change that he made to the painting after he began it, it almost figures for the rape and for the ejaculation itself. There's the witness, one of two witnesses, because of course we're the other, and we're the final ingredient, just as we were in the other picture. We're called upon to express our pity, to learn the lessons of what we're viewing. Titian painted his signature on one of Lucretia's discarded slippers, and I wish I had a proper explanation for that choice of positioning. So I want to finish by talking a little bit about why I think this painting was executed in the way that it was. Titian was using paint in a new way, and I think he was looking at the violence of man and the violence of nature. He was creating a miasma of both facts and uncertainty, and in some ways, his way of painting reflects but not just our way of viewing, but our way of thinking, things coming in and out of focus, skittering, focused, vague, but then the capacity to seize on facts, on the tangible, the dagger, the tears, the bracelet. Titian, I think, was peering into the abyss. And Philip may have had very little control over what he received, but Titian was surely taking into account his role and personality. He was taking on that counselor role that we heard about in the letter to the teenage Philip, the counselor to kings and emperors. And there's a generational shift. Philip was only in his early 40s when this was painted. Titian, as I say, around 80. So I think what we're seeing here is a reiteration of that instruction received by his father. And he's advising sexual and political continence. The execution of the painting coincides with Philip's fourth marriage to his niece, Anne of Austria. And I think it's interesting that for her, Philip abandoned his mistresses and was scrupulously faithful. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm back and looking forward to receiving your questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Patty Danver. I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Engagement at CAM. And Luke, I just want to thank you on behalf of CAM and our audience for that fascinating talk and for sharing your knowledge and your passion of these paintings. We do have some questions for you that have come through during the talk, so we'll get through as many as we can. As a reminder, there is a place at the bottom of your screens where you can ask questions, but as I say, we'll get to as many as we can and apologize to those we don't get to. So our first question, Luke, is from David, who was wondering if you could address misogyny in general that appears in fine art collections and what we can perhaps do about it.
Such a great question. It seems to me that one of the tasks and one of the things that I'm talking about here is, first of all, how do we relate to the present? And also, how then do we take attitudes that were different, potentially, in the past and make sense of them today without forgiving them or indulging them? There were always choices as to how people could be behaved, whether they were your servants or the opposite sex or whatever. And so in the period that we're looking at, the humanities, the studies of the human, as it were directed at learning lessons, at understanding images and objects and stories from the past in a way that we could learn. So I think this is about interpretation. It's certainly not about the removal of images from walls, but it's about understanding what they convey. It's about being nuanced in the way that we look at them. So I think it's easy potentially to condemn a painting like Titian's Rape of Lucretia as sort of voyeuristic or difficult from that point of view. But I think the kind of analysis that I've just given shows that actually Titian was making the absolute opposite point, and that he was teaching Philip, and the picture still has, it seems to me, the power to teach us about the abuse of women in the past. And so I think that's the important thing, is to really analyze each work on its own merit, both according to the standards of the day, recognizing, as I say, that they were not necessarily universally shared. People always had choices, as people have now. I don't want to make too much of a political point, but the abuse of women by men in power, including in political power, is not something that disappeared with Titian's age. So if we don't consider it from the past, we don't tackle these difficult subjects in museum contexts, then we're not doing our job. It's all too cozy. It's all too much about cups of coffee and a nice place to wander around.
Well, thank you. It seems to be a lot about interpretation and honesty. Nicola is asking us, do we know who the model for Venus was?
A really good question. We don't know much about Titian's models, and we do know, though, that certain features are reiterated, and that, yes, he did paint live women in Venice, which were almost certainly coming from the courtesan class, or even less politely, prostitutes. It's very unlikely indeed that a mistress of a king would submit to that kind of thing. These are people who have quite grand positions. When they're married off, they're usually given titles. They're treated with respect, and they have a kind of ambiguity within court life. So they're unlikely, on the whole, to strip off and be painted. Never say never. It happened later on in the 18th and 19th centuries, but at this period, at least, there's no evidence to suggest anything of that kind. So no names, I guess, therefore no pack drill.
Thank you. Some of our questions are about the Fitzwilliam itself.
Okay.
In particular, this next one is asking about the Fitzwilliam during the lockdown and what perhaps we can do to help support the museum during these rather unusual times.
Thank you very much for asking that. It's really a question, and one that isn't easy necessarily to answer. We've been opening and closing, like most museums across the world. We're closed at the moment, sadly. I'm giving this lecture from my kitchen. And I think the ways in which you can help are various. We have supporters groups, including the Mali group, which would be terrific if people felt like joining. And I think too that obviously any direct interest, please come to me via Cambridge in America. But what we're trying to do is to build up our virtual offer during this period, so that we can make the most of the objects that we have and actually reach perhaps more people than we do even in an ordinary year. So the kinds of projects that we're looking for support on are projects of that kind, where not only are we doing tremendous documentation of our own works, but we're also inviting artists of today to look at what we're doing. So do have a look at both our Absol website and the new one that we're shortly going to launch, is the beta website, where some very distinguished artists have imagined their own, have thought about how works of art continue to inhabit their own imaginations even when they can't visit them during lockdown.
We'll be happy to include those links in our follow-up mailings. And as I believe there's a saying of never waste a good crisis. So it sounds very much as though you're going in that direction.
That's exactly right, yeah.
We have just a few minutes left. There's another question about the talk itself, asking why the lutenist may have had his back to us as the viewers.
It's a really, I mean, it's a great question again, and I must admit I haven't thought there isn't a simple answer to it. I think it's something to do with creating a disconnect between the Venus figure, the nude woman, and the man, so that there isn't a way that he's added a kind of way of making it a bit more decorous. It's this sort of antithesis, if you like, of the encounter between Tarquin and Lucretia. It's a respectful turning. She's also turned away from him, and in an odd kind of way, it adds a complication and an interesting nuance to their encounter. You know, is she really there? Is he conjuring her up in his? Is he suddenly aware of her presence? What's going on? You know, and what Titian is inviting us to do is to contemplate, is to meditate about the themes that he's presenting. And so by making an image too simple, too easy to decipher, that's not going to happen. So planting the kinds of questions in your mind which you've just asked me is exactly part of his tactic.
Let's see. We have another question, and I'll be very interested to hear the answer to this. What is your favorite piece in the Fitzwilliam? Do you have one?
I must admit it changes from day to day. It depends very much. There's an incredible painting by Renoir, not always my favorite artist, called The Gust of Wind, which I fell particularly in love with when I first arrived, because it seemed to me to sort of sum up this kind of the glory of being in Cambridge and being able to walk out on Manchester Meadows and have that sort of sense of the rural and the changing seasons. One of the things that's given me particular joy since moving back to the UK is watching spring unfold. Spring in New York, as you all know, is a very sudden event, and it suddenly moves from being very cold to very hot. And so that was a lovely thing. I've always loved actually that tiny little image that I started with, the Paleolithic image of the reindeer, because it says something to me about a fundamental need of the human being to invent and to record the world, invent and to record. And so I love seeing that whole history that we have at Fitzwilliam, with that as its kind of seed and its origin.
It's a very broad array. I'm getting another question that's typing in. I just want to, the present label on the painting, forgive me, I am reading this, is quite bland. Tarquin and the Lucretia, if we remember would you rewrite it, I think is what the bottom line question is.
It's a great question. Yes, I think Tarquin and Lucretia is a terrible title for this picture, and I must admit that one of my first priorities when we come out of lockdown is to use Titian's title, is to talk about Lucretia violated by Tarquin. Otherwise, to me, it sounds as if they might be a couple, or who just happen to have met somewhere, or their brother and sister or something. Tarquin and Lucretia. There are all these books that we were taught to read with, which are Peter and Jane. I don't know, Tarquin and Lucretia, Peter and Jane. Not good.
Yes.
And I think that we can do better than that. A title should explain, to some degree at least, what's happening and give you cues to your own viewing.
Oh, and I think that's a fascinating way for us to end this discussion. Although I think now, having heard you say that, we might want a sequel to see what the new title is.
Right.
But at this point, I just want to thank you again for taking the time for this presentation. I think it was fascinating, and challenges us as viewers and challenges museums to rethink how these collections and how we look at these paintings in today's context. So I think that's all very valuable. I also want to thank all of our viewers for being here, for joining us and being members of the Cambridge community. For more information about the work in Cambridge, please visit our website. Luke, is there anything else you'd like to add before we?
No, I'd just like to say again, thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm sorry that my lecture went on a tiny bit longer than I intended, so squeezed into the question and answer session. And really to say very much that I hope to welcome as many of you as possible at the Fitz in the flesh when we're all able to travel again. It would be very nice to see you.
Great. And we look forward to seeing others in our digital capacity for now and in person again someday. So thank you all very much.